The dark triad. It sounds evil, right? It sounds sinister. It's a theory in psych that has excellent branding behind it. It's a very catchy name, but what is it? I want to take a minute in this video to discuss what the components of this dark triad theory are and talk a little bit about why it's worth exploring, like what the benefit is for society if we understand these personality types better. First thing to know is that in psych, there are sort of two branches. There's applied psych, which talks about, diagnosing certain conditions and treating those conditions. On the other side, there's theoretical psychology, which is more about explaining things. You aren't really seeing patients, you aren't treating patients, you're constructing larger theories about how people behave, how they interact with themselves and the world around them. The dark triad is a theory of personality. It's not a diagnosis, it's not a medical condition. So you can't be diagnosed with dark triad disorder. We're talking largely about subclinical, meaning non-diagnosable traits in people. And effectively, the whole theory says, okay, there are these three personality types: narcissism, psychopathy, and something called Machiavellianism. And the question is, how similar or distinct are these? How much overlap is there between these three types of personality? Back in the late 90s, there were some psychologists that were sitting there going, we've talked about these three personality types for a little while now, but they were wondering if maybe they aren't three separate things. Maybe they are all three manifestations of the same type of personality, the same pattern of cognition and behavior. Turns out most of the evidence suggests that, yeah, they probably are distinct. They are their own things. We've kind of settled on that now to some degree, but there is still a lot of debate about exactly how much overlap and exactly how many parallels there are between each of these three components. So let's break down each of the points of this dark triad. The first one I'm going to talk about is Machiavellianism. And this is an idea that has roots in the political philosophy of a guy named Niccolo Machiavelli. He was an Italian diplomat, kind of political philosopher from the 1500s. He wrote a book called The Prince, and it was supposed to be a handbook, a guide for upcoming monarchs or rulers. His idea was that treaties and trust between allies and doing the right thing are all kind of fluff. And the core most important thing for a ruler to maintain is glory, power, and survival. And to do those, he recommended effectively shedding any kind of moral, ethical code or even ideology. It's that phrase, the ends justify the means. He didn't explicitly say that in the book, but it's effectively what he was saying. That's kind of what that phrase is referring to. So in psychology, Machiavellianism refers to people that employ some of these tactics. Manipulation, for example, deceit. They don't tend to have very close relationships with a lot of emotional strength to them. They don't have a ton of empathy for other people. Other people are sort of a means to an end. They're tools they can use to manipulate and gain power or traction or move a step toward whatever their goals happen to be. There is a lot of overlap between Machiavellianism and psychopathy. And some psychologists even today argue that Machiavellianism is maybe just mild psychopathy, like subclinical, non-pathological, non-diagnosable psychopathy. But the people that argue that they are distinct highlight the fact that with psychopaths, one of the defining traits is a lack of impulse inhibition. Psychopaths tend to have these aggressive, either verbally or physically or socially aggressive outbursts. They have a hard time inhibiting impulses. Whereas people that exhibit Machiavellianism in high levels, they actually have pretty good impulse inhibition. They're pretty good at long-term planning. And actually for this reason, they're usually rated as being better manipulators than even psychopaths because they have that ability to keep their emotions and these outbursts in check. The next point in this dark triad triangle is narcissism. And narcissism also kind of has historical roots. It's named after this Greek myth of a guy named Narcissus. And he was beautiful and he knew it. And everybody fell in love with him. Everybody flocked to him. But he was a little vain, a little self-centered, didn't return that love, didn't reciprocate, and eventually happened upon his reflection in a lake and fell in love with his reflection because it was so beautiful, couldn't pry himself away from his own reflection, and died, withered away, wasted away on the bank of the lake and just died right there. So vanity, maybe an over estimation of your own self-worth, or what we call grandiosity in psychology. And in some cases, it can rise all the way up to a clinical level. Like you can be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. With the dark triad, though, we're usually talking about subclinical examples of narcissism. In these cases, the defining feature is, like I said, something called grandiosity. And this is an exaggerated belief in your own special uniqueness, your own importance. You might believe that your experience is so unusual and so unique and so special, that you are such an elevated individual that other people, the unwashed masses, couldn't possibly understand you or your deep, complex intelligence and your feelings and your experience with the world. And a lot of times these people feel and act entitled, obviously, and they can display arrogant behaviors. I mean, sometimes you see in narcissism like high levels of infidelity. They feel entitled to other sexual partners and opportunities. Now, compared to people that are high in Machiavellian traits, narcissists tend to be a little more, you could call it pro-social. They tend to be a little more extroverted, a little more open. They tend to be a little more socially positive and a little less malevolent in general. Now, again, these three personality traits all kind of run together and overlap, so it shouldn't be a surprise that narcissism actually has pretty high correlations with psychopathy, which is the next point in our triangle. Now, psychopathy is, I'd argue, the darkest of the dark triad. It's the one that you might classically associate with the term evil compared to the other two. The other two aren't great, but psychopathy gets real dark real fast. There are a lot of competing models of what exactly psychopathy is. There seem to be three common points that unite each of these models for the most part: boldness, disinhibition, and meanness. Those are the three really defining traits of psychopathy. So first, boldness. This ties into the whole thrill-seeking aspect I mentioned. Psychopaths show low levels of fear in general. They tend to have a pretty high stress tolerance. And they're usually pretty confident and pretty socially assertive. So whatever you may consider bold, whether that's social aggression or assertiveness, or whether that is, this danger kind of thrill-seeking aspect of behavior, that is pretty common in psychopaths. Then we have disinhibition. This is that poor impulse control. They have a hard time with long-term planning because long-term planning, executing long-term plans usually requires focus and impulse control. They have a hard time managing their behavior, restraining their behavior. They have a hard time resisting the urge for immediate gratification. That ties into the thrill-seeking stuff. Then we have meanness. Now, meanness is common probably to all three of the dark triad personality traits. This is, again, low empathy, a lack of close personal attachments, no problem using things like cruelty and manipulation to gain control and power over others, or control and power in an organization. And they tend to exploit people and defy authority. That it's not typically it's not an ideal manager in a workplace. So those are the main three components. So we talked a little bit about what they are, how they differ from each other. The reason that they're all lumped into this dark triad theory is that although they are distinct personality traits, there is a lot of common ground between the three. Big ones are, I keep mentioning, lack of empathy for other people. That's a massive, massive theme that keeps recurring through each of these points of the triad. In addition, a lot of interpersonal hostility. These are not people that have very strong, close personal attachments, very trusting relationships. And then low agreeableness. And in psychology, agreeableness is a very specific term. It refers to people that are kind and cooperative, they're considerate, they're sympathetic to other people. So you can see where people that land somewhere on this dark triad tend to be very low in those traits. So what's the point of studying the dark triad as a theory of personality? Well, when we look at the three of these together, you can kind of see some interesting patterns emerge. So for example, people that tend to land on this dark triad tend to be present in upper management and CEO positions or middle management. There's a lot of studies that look at dark triad personality traits in the workplace. People that exhibit these dark triad traits are very manipulative, and that's probably part of why they have climbed this corporate ladder. But what's interesting is, depending on kind of where their traits are concentrated. If they exhibit more narcissistic tendencies than psychopathic, for example, the way that they manipulate people might differ. They have different strategies. So Machiavellian individuals tend to be real charming and real charismatic. Now it's a front, obviously, it's manipulative, but they get their way through that kind of charisma and charm. People who are narcissists tend to use their looks.
You look great. Very fit.
You can always be thinner, look better.
There's actually been a few studies where they'll flash photos of people who have been diagnosed with like narcissistic personality disorder and people that haven't. And on average, people rate the narcissist as more physically attractive. But when you control for things like makeup, hair, you kind of make everyone dress down, that effect goes away, which suggests that narcissists, as you know, is the case with the Greek myth that they're named after, they tend to spend a lot more time with grooming and improving their appearance. And this ends up being actually a pretty effective strategy in manipulating people and endearing yourself to people and getting your way. And with psychopaths, while there can be manipulation and things along those lines, their unique flavor in this mess of the dark triad is they tend to manipulate people more with threats.
I already fired you! Why are you still here?
Whether they're physical threats, social threats, verbal threats, whatever. And again, that's that really unique aspect of that lack of inhibition that specifically defines psychopathy. But all three are manipulative, and all three are not really great examples of leadership. And they can climb that ladder to some degree, but they tend to produce very toxic and inefficient workplaces. And we can also learn a little bit about crime and violence by studying this dark triad. People that score high in these dark triad traits tend to also be more likely to commit violent crimes and engage in intimate partner violence. People that land on this dark triad tend to have some common themes in the way they approach politics. They usually gravitate toward the more extreme ends of the political spectrum, either far right or far left. They tend to embrace authoritarianism. In psychology, we talk about in-group, out-group stuff. So whatever we are, whatever they are, it can be your family, not your family. It can be people that are fans of your sports team, not your sports team, your political group, not your political group, or your ethnicity, race, your country, not your country. The out group is can be perceived as a very threatening other, a scary group of people that are antagonistic to your goals and ideals. People who score high on dark triad measures also tend to score very high on perceptions of out-group threat. They tend to see the other, however they define it, as very scary. They tend to score very high in anti-immigration sentiment, and they have a pretty high belief in the supremacy of whatever their own in-group is. Now, often you can see how this could correlate to things like white supremacist organizations. You got a far-right ideology, authoritarian beliefs, anti-immigrant policies, a fear of the out-group, and a heavy belief in internal supremacy. So that's a quick overview of what the dark triad is and why it's worth looking at. I mean, we can understand each of these three personality traits by themselves. We totally could. You spend your entire life and career just exploring psychopathy. But when we look at them as a larger whole, it gives us a more holistic approach and understanding to human behavior, because a lot of times, psychopaths are also narcissists. Or, with that overlap, we get a more multivariate, higher dimensional picture of these people, how they think, and how they interact with and influence our society. Hope you found that interesting. If you have any questions about the dark triad and how it relates to behavior, leave a comment and I will do my absolute best to answer it. If you have any other topics that you kind of are curious to explore, you can leave a comment about that too. This video, the idea for it came from a comment on the psychopathy video. So I'm always kind of excited to hear ideas or topics that you happen to be interested in. And thanks for watching. Have an excellent rest of your day.